Hi, everybody. What I decided to do for my research plan for this discussion video is to build upon my interest that I talked about the first two discussion videos, and that is the professionalization of childbirth in the antebellum South. Now, I decided to lay mine out just like I would if I had written my research plan. So first, the abstract of my thesis. What I would be looking to do is to compare the birth experience between white Southern women to that of Black enslaved women. And further, I would like to explore the pros and cons of having either a midwife present or a physician present or both present, and how their techniques affected the pregnant women and the newborns, the infants, and really how the data and improvements that were collected during this time period really affect today pregnant women in this field. There are a lot of things that we learned during the antebellum South period that we still use today in this field. Now, this project would be unique because others have looked at this topic. However, there hasn't been a comparison between white women and enslaved women during this time period, and there's really no comparison to how that affected today's modern medicine. I think this was really the growing point of where obstetricians came from. Now, the biggest problems I've mentioned before that I'm going to encounter is in my primary resources that enslaved women were most likely illiterate. They weren't able to write their own stories. Thus, theirs comes from a third person perspective of their situation. So that is going to be a major problem. Another issue that I will encounter is childbirth during the antebellum South period was seen as a miracle from God. Now, I'm not saying it's not a miracle. I'm just saying that they didn't complain about it in their writing. It was just a burden that they had to suffer. That may be the case, but today we know childbirth is painful. Childbirth doesn't always go as planned and doesn't make it any less a miracle. But those are the realities that they kind of shielded people from during the time period. Now, my methodology that I'm going to look at, I'm going to look at primary sources, diaries, doctor's notes, slaveholders' notes. In my bibliography, I'm going to talk about an instance where a book was notated by a slaveholder, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. And I want to also look at what current historians are saying about the topic and compare that to possibilities for where my research could go. Now, the bibliography that I chose for this is, I mentioned it before, Birthing a Slave by Maria Jenkins Swartz, published in 2006. This book is very good for this topic because it has a lot of primary sources listed throughout that talk about the study of childbirth from the slave's perspective. Best they can. Remember my issue with the primary sources. The next text that I used for this bibliography is by John Gunn. It is The Domestic Medicine or Poor Man's Friend, published in 1838. Now, this book is very interesting because it served as a how-to manual for slaveholders who didn't want to have a midwife present or a physician. They were trying to sometimes save money, sometimes for different reasons. They might not have been available. This told them the different techniques they could use on their slaves during childbirth, the different approaches that they could use. And in one instance I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there is a slaveholder who actually put notes in the margins of this book explaining what went well and what didn't go well and what to try next time. So that would be a very interesting source in itself. Now, the two sources that I want to talk about here for this is, the first one is by Catherine Poe, and it is The Politics of Reproduction, Race, Medicine, and Fertility in the Age of Abolition, and it was published in 2017. In this text, it's a book, I may have mistakenly called it an article there for a moment. They discuss the aspirations of the South to mimic the Caribbean slave society. So I've talked about it before. Whenever the Act of 1807 came into place, the slaves were no longer allowed to be imported. So the increase of slave labor completely depended upon natural increase. So that importance of slave reproduction, that importance of having a successful delivery, keeping the slave safe and the newborn safe, became a top priority. And we are going to see an influx of medicine and different providers in the South coming in to help keep this group of people safe. That text discusses that, and it would be a very good source for this project. The next source is by Robert Baker, and it is titled Before Bioethics, A History of American Medical Ethics from the Colonial Period to the Bioethics Revolution. This was published in 2013. And this talks about the evolution of midwifery in the medical field. It talks about the different oaths that they had to take. Midwives in the North had a very different training than those of the South. And this would be a good comparison because white women of the South, if they had a midwife, they wanted somebody trained, where slaves, they didn't have that option. So this is going to really be the evolution of how medicine is brought into the South whenever it comes to midwifery or a physician. So thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I hope you're all staying safe.